Part 4, Chapter 2. At 5 a.m., the first hint of a brightening sky marked the ending of the night. It was April 10th. The weather at daybreak was hardly encouraging, overcast and hazy, with a strong easterly wind driving intermittent snow squalls across the icy water. Neither Clarence nor Elephant Island was visible, and Worsley could only estimate that they lay generally to the north, between 30 and 40 miles away. The easterly wind had blown new masses of ice around their floe, so that once again they seemed trapped. But there were signs of an opening, and after breakfast everything was made ready for a quick start. Shackleton decided to lighten the boats by abandoning some ice tools and several cases of dried vegetables. Shortly before 8 o'clock, the pack began to loosen, and at 8:10 Shackleton gave the order to launch the boats. The sea was broken by a nasty chop, which made the boats lurch heavily and rowing extremely difficult. But before long the ice began to open up, and within an hour or so they found themselves in a vast expanse of ice-free water. So broad they could hardly see the pack to either side. It was a welcome sight after more than a year of looking at nothing but ice. Shackleton had the word passed to hoist sail. The Caird was fitted with 2 masts for a main and a mizzen sail, plus a small jib in the bow. The docker carried a single lug sail, and the Wills mounted only a very small mainsail and jib. The boats were thus hardly fit sailing companions, and this fact immediately became apparent when the sails were set. The Caird caught the wind and heeled to port, drawing steadily ahead of the other 2 boats. Though the docker was somewhat faster than the Wills, the difference was slight, and neither boat could sail into the wind. There was nothing for the Caird to do but to hang back so as to not outdistance the others. Toward mid-morning, the boats came to a boundary of pack ice stretching in a long, closely packed line, apparently following the current. The floes were old and stately veterans that had survived years of pressure, had emerged at last from the Weddell Sea to melt on the fringes of Antarctica. Their edges, instead of being fresh and sharp, where they had been newly broken, were worn and eroded by the water. For more than an hour, the 3 boats proceeded west along the edge of this line of ancient floes, and then, shortly after 11 o'clock, a passage was discovered, and the men rowed through. They realized immediately that they must be in the open ocean. Ironically, here was the moment they had dreamed of, ever since the days at Ocean Camp. But the reality was vastly different from the dream. As soon as the boats emerged from the protective barrier of the pack, they were struck by the full force of the wind, and a high, breaking sea was running down from the northeast. Freezing spray burst over them as they tried to beat their way to the north-northeast under sail. Time after time, icy blasts whipped them across the face, and the penetrating wind seemed all the colder because of their lack of sleep. In the docker, Ordlees and Kerr slumped down onto their pile of sleeping bags, miserably seasick. Yet the men complained very little. They knew that somewhere, through the mists, probably not more than 24 miles to the north, there was land, and they were actually making for it, and getting closer all the time. When it came time for lunch, Shackleton permitted a hearty ration of biscuits, cold sledging ration, dog pemmican, and 6 lumps of sugar. Early in the afternoon, however, the wind increased considerably, and the boats began to take on water at a dangerous rate. For more than an hour, Shackleton kept to a northeasterly course, hoping that the boats would somehow prove equal to the seas. But toward 2 o'clock, he realized that it was foolhardy to press on, and ordered them back behind the protective line of the pack. The boats came about and sped southward before the following wind. Within minutes they had reached the edge of the pack, and they proceeded westward, looking for a floe to which they might make fast. The largest single piece of ice they could find was what Worsley described as a Flowberg, a thick mass of dark blue pressure ice, about 35 yards square, which rose in some places to a height of 15 feet above water. It was floating alone, isolated from the rest of the line of pack, and it had obviously been adrift for a long time. The seas had eaten around its waterline, leaving an overhanging girdle of rotten ice. The perils of the sleepless night before were still altogether too vivid in Shackleton's memory to risk again. The party would have to spend the night in the boats. They pulled up alongside the Flowberg and drove oars into the ice. When they made the bow lines of the boats fast to the oars, and the boats lay off to wait for darkness. Within minutes, however, the wind freshened out of the northeast and the sea picked up. The boats began to bump heavily against one another, and they threatened to uproot the oars, which held them to the floe. In addition, the wind swirled across the surface of the berg, catching snow from its surface and hurling it straight into their faces. After about a half hour of this misery, Shackleton had no choice. If the men were to sleep, and they had to sleep, there was no alternative to camping on the ice. Reluctantly, he gave the order. The boats were maneuvered alongside the Flowberg, and about half the party scrambled onto the ice. The stores and equipment were quickly passed up. Then came the ordeal with the boats. The rotten overhang around the edge of the Flowberg was steep and treacherous, rising an almost perpendicular 5 feet out of the water. Thus, the boats had to be hauled almost straight up, while the men pulled from a safe distance back from the edge. The Wills was first, and she was raised without incident. The dock was not so easy. She was halfway up when the ice gave way, and Bill Stevenson, one of the firemen, plunged into the numbing water. A half-dozen hands pulled him to safety. The Caird was last, and again the overhang broke. Shackleton, Wild, and Hurley were just able to grab hold of the boat before they fell in. It was 3:30 before the boats were safe, and by then the men were very nearly exhausted. They had hardly slept for 36 hours. Their hands, unaccustomed to rowing, were blistered and a little frostbitten. Their clothes were soaked from the spray in the boat, and when they unrolled their sleeping bags, they found them wet through. But all that mattered then was sleep. After a supper of cold dog pemmican, milk, and 2 lumps of sugar, they wriggled, fully dressed, into their sleeping bags. A few men, before they closed their eyes, put forth one last bit of effort to record the day's events briefly in their diaries. Worsley wrote, "By my reckoning, we make today northwest 10 miles, and the current should run us well to the west before this strong easterly breeze." And Hurley recorded the one thought that was uppermost in all their minds: "Pray God, this floe will remain entire throughout the night." By some miracle, or by some minor miracle, it did, but long before dawn, they became aware that something was seriously wrong. At sunrise, they awakened to a terrifying spectacle of nature. During the night, the wind had risen almost to gale force, and from somewhere to the northeast, great quantities of pack had drifted down on them. Now, it extended unbroken to the horizon in every direction. Berg fragments and shattered floes in 10,000 different shapes obliterated the surface of the water. And out of the northwest, rollers 30 feet high, stretching from horizon to horizon, swept down through the pack in long, implacable lines of half-mile apart. At their summits, the Flowberg was lifted to what seemed like dizzying heights, then dropped into valleys from which the horizon was obscured. The air was filled with a dull, muddled roar and low shriek of the wind, and the seas breaking hoarsely among the pack, along the incessant booming grind of the ice. Because of its size, the berg was drifting more slowly than the rest of the pack, which bore down upon it and pounded it on every side, while the surge of the swell was undermining it by eating away at the waterline. Periodically, decayed chunks dropped away from one side or another, and others were torn loose by floe fragments, hurled against the berg by the seas. At each impact, the berg shuddered sickeningly. This was precisely the situation Shackleton had feared since the first appearance of the swell at Patient Camp. The berg was crumbling beneath them, and might split or upend at any moment. And yet, to launch the boats would have been idiocy. They would have been splintered to bits in 90 seconds. The whole scene had a kind of horrifying fascination. The men stood by, tense and altogether aware that in the next instant they might be flung into the sea to be crushed or drowned, or to flounder in the icy water until the spark of life was chilled from their bodies. And yet the grandeur of the spectacle before them was undeniable. Watching it, many of them sought to put their feeling into words, but they could find no words that were adequate. The lines in Tennyson's Mort D'Arthur kept running through Macklin's head. I never saw, nor shall see, here or elsewhere, till I die, not though I live 3 lives of mortal men, so great a miracle. Shackleton climbed to a knoll a dozen feet high at one end of the berg, from which he could see the limitless expanse of ice. Here and there, far away, a black line or a small dark patch revealed a lead or a pool of open water. The party's only hope was that one of these openings would drift down and surround the berg, making possible their escape. But time and time again, a lead would approach to within a short distance, then veer to one side or another, or vanish altogether as the ice closed up. Hour after hour they waited, 8, 9, 10 o'clock. Since dawn, the boats had been ready, and the stores and equipment lay close by for immediate loading. The men stood looking up at Shackleton atop the little knoll. From beneath, the defiant line of his chin was accentuated, but the tired circles around his eyes told the strain he was under. Occasionally, he would call to them to stand by. A chance was coming. The men would rush to the boats and wait, but after a time, Shackleton would look down and shake his head. The chance was gone. While they waited, the berg was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece. Later in the morning, a huge sea burst against it, and a 20-foot section slipped into the water, leaving a half-submerged shelf of ice behind. This ice shelf was awash, and it greatly increased the strain on the berg by keeping it from rolling naturally with the swell. There was a good chance that the berg would split through horizontally, and that the whole top would be sheared off. Noon came. The berg was smaller, but the ice was just as close. If anything, the swell was higher. Some sledging ration was issued, and the men ate, standing in little groups, talking quietly. By 1 o'clock, a sickening thought had begun to spread through the party. What if darkness came, and the ice was still tight? With the beating it was taking, the berg could not possibly last until the next morning. They would be pitched into the sea during the night. The men made feeble jokes about it, tried to resign themselves, or simply tried not to think about it. Greenstreet took his diary and attempted to write, "A very anxious time as our floe was rocking and rolling heavily being." The diary ended there in mid-sentence. It was no good. He couldn't keep his mind on it. Shortly before 2 o'clock, when only about 3 hours of daylight remained, a somber quiet came over the party. Lead after lead had drifted past, too far away to do them any good. They were watching Shackleton as he followed still another lead approaching from the north, but no one thought it would really be their chance. There was an excited shout. A pool was opening in the opposite direction. They turned and stared. What they saw was almost beyond belief. The ice was mysteriously drawing away, as if under the influence of some invisible force. As they looked, eddies and swirls riffled the surface of the water. A freak current had apparently risen from the depths of the sea and been deflected against the deep underside of the berg. They jumped up and down, pointing and gesturingly wildly toward the pool of inky water that was widening out from the berg. "Launch the boats," Shackleton cried as he raced down from his perch. "Chuck in the stores any old way." Anxious hands seized the boats and hurried them to the edge of the berg. The surface of the sea was 5 feet beneath them, so the men almost pitched the boats off the ice into the water. Crewmen dropped into them, and the stores were hurried on board. There was a bad moment when the ice shelf rose up and threatened to capsize the docker, but she was hurriedly shoved out of the danger, and in 5 minutes the boats were away. They pulled to the center of the pool, and from there they could still see another pool beyond a narrow neck of brash ice. They pushed through the ice, and then the pack, in its inexplicable way, began to dissipate, leaving an ample margin of open water around them. Until now, the destination had been either Clarence or Elephant Island, whichever the party happened to strike. These were the most logical choices, the closest bits of land. At the time the boats were launched from Patience Camp, Clarence Island lay just 39 miles, almost due north. By sailing northwest, they had reduced that distance to about 25 miles north-northeast, Worsley estimated. However, it had been 2 days since the last observation, and during that time, the strong winds out of the northeast had probably blown the party a considerable distance to the west. Furthermore, the greatest quantities of open water now extended to the southwest, toward King George Island, 80-odd miles away. Shackleton made the decision on the spot. They would abandon the effort to reach Clarence or Elephant Island and take advantage of the following wind to make for King George Island. It was a much more desirable destination anyhow. Both Clarence and Elephant Islands were remote, and so far as Shackleton knew, had never been visited. But from King George Island, a series of island-to-island voyages, the longest of which was 19 miles, would carry the party ultimately to Deception Island, some 100 miles beyond. Here, the remains of a volcano's cone made an excellent harbor, and the place was a frequent port of call for whalers. 2, there was thought to be a cache of food at Deception Island for the use of castaways. But most important, there was a small, rude chapel there, built by the whalers. Even if no ships stopped at the island, Shackleton was sure they could tear down the church and use its lumber to build a boat large enough to accommodate all of them. They held to a southwest course throughout the afternoon. About 3:30, Shackleton signaled from the Caird to hoist sail, and almost immediately the inequalities in the three boats became apparent once more. The Caird clove neatly through the water, followed by the Docker, but the wheels limped along astern, dropping farther back all the while. After a time, Shackleton brought the Caird up under the lee of some ice and shouted to Worsley to go back after the Wills. It took almost an hour for the Docker to beat her way to windward, take the Wills in tow, and return to the Caird. By the time the three boats were joined up once more, darkness was rapidly approaching, and Shackleton was afraid of a collision with the ice. Their boats took in their sails and proceeded under the oars. In the last glimmer of light, they found a floe and drew alongside it. But there was to be no camping this night, nor ever again, so far as Shackleton was concerned. They had learned their lesson twice over, and they were through with the ice for good. The only man to depart now was Green, who carried his blubber stove and supplies onto the floe. He brewed up some seal hoosh and warmed some milk. The men ate sitting in the boats. When they had finished, they cast off. The boats were made fast, one behind the other, with the Docker in the lead. Then the party began to row very slowly toward the southwest. They took spells at the oars, 2 men pulling at a time. Others hunched in the bows of the boats as lookouts, watching for the edge of the pack so that the boats might stay behind its protective line, and keeping an eye out for the bergs or large floes that might catch and crush the boats. It had begun to snow, large wet flakes that clung and melted. The snow doubled the discomfort of the lookouts, straining their eyes into the wind to watch for ice drifting down out of the darkness. The period at the oars was kept short so that each man had a turn as often as possible. It was the only way to keep warm. Those who were not rowing or on lookout did what they could to keep their blood moving, but sleep was out of the question, for there was nowhere to lie down. The bottom of each boat was so packed with stores that there was scarcely room for the men's feet. Sleeping bags and tents took up most of the space in the bows, and the 2 thwarts on which the oarsmen sat had to be kept free. That left only a small space midships for the off-duty men to sit in a tight little group, huddled together for warmth. Throughout the night, the sudden eruption of water nearby and a sound like a steam valve popping under pressure told of whales blowing close at hand. They became the primary worry during that long black night. Whales had been seen on hundreds of occasions, tossing aside vast chunks of floes as they surfaced to breathe, and the ability of a whale to discriminate between the underside of a floe and the white bottoms of the boats was open to serious question. About 3 a.m., the entire party was suddenly electrified by an almost hysterical shout from Hudson. A light! A light! He was pointing to the northwest. Every man sat upright, staring off in the direction Hudson indicated. The excitement lasted for only one cruel moment, until they were alert enough to realize the absurdity of it. Then they settled down again, cursing Hudson for his stupidity and for having raised their hopes. Hudson insisted that he had seen it, and for several minutes he sat disconsolately, mumbling to himself because nobody would believe him. Toward 5 o'clock, the sky began to brighten. Before long, the dawn of April 12th broke, in radiant splendor along the horizon. The sun started its climb into a cloudless sky, and the mere sight of it seemed to change the whole shape of things. They rode alongside a large floe, and Green again jumped ashore to prepare some seal hush and hot milk. After breakfast, they cast off and set sail to the southwest, under perfect conditions. Wide stretches of open water, protected by a line of pack on which hundreds of seals lay sleeping. About 10:30, Worsley took out his sextant. Then, bracing himself against the mast of the docker, he carefully took his sight, the first since leaving Patience Camp. At noon, he repeated the procedure as the boats lay awaiting the result. Every face was turned toward Worsley as he sat in the bottom of the docker, working out his figures. They watched to see his expression when the 2 lines of position were plotted for a fix. He took him much longer than usual, and gradually a puzzled look came over his face. He checked his calculations over, and the expression of puzzlement gave way to one of worry. Once more he ran through his computations. Then he slowly raised his head. Shackleton had brought the Caird alongside the docker, and Worsley showed him the position: 62 degrees 15 minutes south, 53 degrees 7 minutes west. They were 124 miles nearly due east of King George Island and 61 miles southeast of Clarence Island, 22 miles farther from the land than when they had launched the boats from Patience Camp 3 days before.